They called her the Unwanted, a woman whose face was so marred by fire and cruelty that her own father couldn't look her in the eye. In the harsh winter of 1874, in a town God forgot called Purgatory Creek, she wasn't given away in marriage, she was sold to settle a gambling debt. Her buyer, Jeremiah Holt, a mountain man, whispered to be more bear than human, a ghost who lived above the snow line. Everyone thought she was going to her death, but they were wrong. Jeremiah didn't buy her for the reason they thought, and what he saw when he looked at her wasn't a monster. It was the key to a secret that would burn the whole territory to the ground. This is the true untold story of Clementine and the Mountain Man. The saloon smelled of stale beer, wet wool, and the metallic tang of desperation. In Purgatory Creek, the sun didn't seem to rise so much as bruise the horizon, casting a sickly purple light over the muddy thoroughfare. Inside the Gilded Spur, the mood was ugly. Clementine O'Hara sat on a wooden crate in the far corner, her head bowed low. She wore a bonnet made of heavy, rough cotton, the brim pulled down so far it nearly touched her nose. A thick veil stained with the dust of the trail obscured her features completely. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, gripping her knuckles so tight the skin was white. She was 22 years old, but in that moment she felt small, like a child, waiting for a punishment she didn't understand, but knew she deserved. At the poker table in the center of the room sat her father, Otis O'Hara. Otis was a man who had once been handsome, but whiskey and years of chasing fool's gold had eroded him into a jagged, shivering wreck. Sweat beaded on his forehead, rolling down into his graying beard. Opposite him sat Beaufort Taggart. Taggart was the richest man in the territory and the meanest. He owned the mine, the bank, and the sheriff. He wore a suit of fine, black broadcloth that looked out of place amidst the sawdust and spittoons. His eyes were like flint, hard, cold, and ready to spark. "You're out of chips, Otis," Taggart said, his voice smooth as oil. He idly flipped a gold coin over his knuckles. "And you're out of luck. The deed to your claim is already in the pot. You've got nothing left but the shirt on your back, and frankly, I wouldn't use that to wipe my boots." Otis swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room. The few patrons, miners, drifters, and exhausted working girls watched in silence. They knew the smell of a man at the end of his rope. "I got something else," Otis stammered. He pointed a shaking finger toward the corner, toward Clementine. A ripple of uneasy laughter went through the room. "That," Taggart sneered, not even looking at her. "The girl with the veil, Otis, everyone from here to Denver knows about your daughter. They say she's cursed. They say looking at her face would curdle fresh milk. What use do I have for a scarred-up kitchen maid? She's strong," Otis pleaded, his voice cracking. "She can cook. She can clean. She don't talk back. She's all I have left, Beaufort. Just for the debt. Take her for the debt." Clementine closed her eyes behind the veil. A hot tear tracked through the ruined landscape of her left cheek. Sold. Her own father was selling her like a mule to cover a debt incurred by whiskey and greed. She waited for Taggart to laugh, to kick Otis out, to end this humiliation. Instead, the saloon doors swung open. The wind howled in bringing a swirl of snow and a sudden drop in temperature. The silence in the room deepened, becoming heavy and suffocating. A man stepped through the doorway, and he was massive. He had to duck to clear the frame. He wore a coat made of buffalo hide, the fur thick and matted with snow. His boots were heavy leather, wrapped in burlap for warmth. A beard, dark and streaked with premature grey, covered the lower half of his face, and his hair hung long and wild beneath a battered Stetson. He carried a Winchester rifle in the crook of his arm, like it was a toy. This was Jeremiah Holt. The locals called him the Ghost of the Peaks. He lived past the timberline, where the air was too thin for normal men. They said he had killed a grizzly with a knife. They said he had found the lost Dutchman's mine and buried it again. They said he ate raw meat and slept in the snow. Jeremiah walked to the bar, his spurs chiming with a heavy, dull clank. He ignored the room, ignored Taggart, and ignored Otis. He placed a heavy canvas sack on the bar. It hit the wood with a solid thud that spoke of lead or gold. "Whiskey," he rumbled. His voice sounded like rocks grinding together in a landslide. The bartender, a man named Saul, who usually had a shotgun within reach, hurriedly poured a glass with a trembling hand. Taggart, annoyed at losing the room's attention, cleared his throat. "We were in the middle of business here, Holt." Jeremiah turned slowly. His eyes were startlingly blue, piercing through the grime and the gloom. He looked at Taggart, then at the sweating, weeping Otis, and finally his gaze landed on the small figure in the corner. He stared at Clementine for a long time. She felt his gaze like a physical weight. It wasn't lecherous, and it wasn't mocking. It was calculating. "What's the bid?" Jeremiah asked. Taggart blinked. "Excuse me." "The girl," Jeremiah said, gesturing with his chin. "You were haggling. What's the price?" Otis looked up, hope warring with terror. $500. The debt is $500. "She ain't worth 5 cents, Taggart spat. "Show him Otis. Show him the goods." Clementine froze. This was the nightmare. The moment the veil was lifted, the gasps, the recoiling, the pity. "No," Jeremiah said sharply. He took a step closer to the table. "I don't need to see." He reached into his coat and pulled out a pouch. He tossed it onto the poker table. It spilled open, revealing raw nuggets of gold, unrefined and jagged. "That's 600, Jeremiah said. 5 for the debt, 1 for the supplies she'll need." The room went dead silent. $600 was a fortune. It was enough to build a house, buy a herd, start a new life. Taggart stared at the gold. He was a greedy man, but he wasn't stupid. He knew gold when he saw it. He also knew that crossing Jeremiah Holt was a good way to disappear into the mountains and never be found. "Sold," Taggart said, scooping the nuggets toward him. He looked at Otis with a sneer. "You're clear, Otis. Get out of my sight before I change my mind." Otis scrambled up, clutching his empty bottle, and ran out to the back door without a single glance at his daughter. Jeremiah turned to Clementine. He walked over to her, his massive shadow engulfing her. He extended a hand. It was the size of a shovel blade, scarred and calloused, the fingernails dark with earth. "Let's go," he said. Clementine stood up. Her legs were shaking so badly, she thought she might collapse. She didn't take his hand. She simply nodded, gathered her thin shawl and walked toward the door. As she passed Taggart, he leaned in and whispered, "Good luck with the beast, Scarface. He'll probably eat you by morning." She stepped out into the biting wind, leaving the warmth of humanity behind, following a stranger into the cold unknown. The journey up the mountain was a brutal education in endurance. Jeremiah Holt did not own a carriage. He had 2 horses, a massive black stallion that looked as mean as its owner, and a sturdy, shaggy pack mule. He threw a saddle onto the mule without a word and gestured for Clementine to mount. She struggled with her skirts, the heavy fabric wet with snow, until he grew impatient. He grabbed her by the waist, his grip firm but surprisingly gentle, and hoisted her up effortlessly. "Hold on," he said. "The trail gets steep." For the first 3 hours they didn't speak. They left the muddy ruts of Purgatory Creek behind, ascending through the pine forests, where the trees grew tall and straight. Then they passed the timberline, entering a world of jagged grey rock and blinding white snow. The air grew thin and sharp, stinging Clementine's lungs with every breath. She watched his back. He rode ahead, his posture erect, scanning the horizon constantly. He seemed a part of this landscape, as unyielding and dangerous as the cliffs themselves. Why had he bought her? The question looped in her mind like a fever dream. Men didn't pay $600 for a scarred servant. Was he lonely? Was he mad? Or was he something worse? As the sun began to set, painting the snow in hues of blood, orange, and violet, the temperature plummeted. Clementine began to shiver violently. Her coat was threadbare, a hand-me-down from a mother she barely remembered. Jeremiah stopped his horse. He dismounted and walked back to her. He stripped off his buffalo hide coat. Underneath he wore a thick wool shirt and a buckskin vest. "Put this on," he ordered, holding up the massive coat. "I can't," she chattered, her teeth clicking. "You'll freeze." "I don't freeze," he said simply. He draped the coat over her. It was heavy, smelling of pine resin, tobacco, and musk. It swallowed her whole, instantly trapping her body heat. "My cabin is another hour. Don't fall asleep. You sleep, you die." They pressed on. The darkness was absolute, save for the brilliant tapestry of stars overhead. Just when Clementine thought she could no longer feel her toes, a shape emerged from the gloom. It wasn't the hovel she expected. It was a cabin, yes, but large and solidly built from massive logs. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney. A lean-to stable was attached to the side. Jeremiah helped her down. Her legs gave way, immediately numb from the cold and the ride. He caught her, sweeping her up into his arms. She stiffened, expecting something. But he just carried her to the door, kicked it open, and brought her inside. The interior was warm. A fire crackled in a hearth large enough to roast a pig. There were rugs made of bear and wolf skin on the floor. Bookshelves lined one wall, an oddity that Clementine noted through her exhaustion. He deposited her in a chair near the fire. "Thaw out," he said. "I have to settle the horses." He left her alone. Clementine looked around. The cabin was clean organized with a military precision. There was a kitchen area with cast-iron skillets hanging in size order. A narrow door led to a back room. When Jeremiah returned, he carried saddlebags and a bucket of fresh snow, which he set near the fire to melt. He looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since the saloon. "Take off the veil," he said. It wasn't a request. Clementine's hands flew to her face. "No." Jeremiah stopped stoking the fire. He stood to his full height. "I paid for you, Clementine. I own the debt, but I don't own you. You understand the difference?" She didn't, not really. But his tone wasn't threatening. It was weary. "I need to know who I'm living with," he said. "Take it off." Trembling, she reached up. Her fingers fumbled with the pins. Slowly, agonizingly, she lifted the thick lace. She braced herself for the flinch, the look of disgust. Her face was a map of pain. The right side was delicate, almost beautiful, with a large green eye and a soft mouth. But the left side, from her hairline down to her jaw, was a shiny, twisted mass of red and purple scar tissue. It pulled at her left eye, making it droop slightly. It was the result of a lantern accident. When she was 6, a fire started during one of her father's drunken rages. She stared at the floor, unable to meet his gaze. Jeremiah stepped closer. He reached out a hand. She flinched, pulling back. He paused, letting his hand hover in the air until she stilled. Then, with the tip of his rough finger, he traced the edge of the scar on her jaw. "Fire," he murmured. "Yes," she whispered. "Does it still hurt?" She shook her head. "Only when it's very cold, or when people stare." "I'm not staring at the scar," Jeremiah said. "I'm looking at the chin. You have the O'Hara chin, just like your grandfather." Clementine looked up, startled. "You knew my grandfather." "Everyone knew Liam O'Hara," Jeremiah said, turning back to the fire. "He was a good man, unlike his son." He grabbed a knife and a slab of cured bacon. "There's a room in the back. It has a lock on the inside. You'll sleep there. I sleep out here." Clementine blinked, confused. "But I thought—" "You thought I bought a warmer for my bed." Jeremiah sliced the bacon with violent precision. "If I wanted a woman, I could have had one in town without paying $600. I bought you because you were dying down there, girl. You were dying by inches in that saloon. Up here, things are simpler. You work, you eat, you live." He pointed the knife at the back door. "Go. Check the lock. Make yourself feel safe. Then come back out. You're cooking tonight." Clementine walked to the door and opened it. Inside was a small room with a cot, a pile of quilts, and a small window with heavy shutters. And there on the door was a heavy iron slide bolt. She slid it shut. Clack. Then she slid it open. Clack. For the first time in 10 years, she locked a door and knew she was the one holding the key. She took a deep breath, removed her bonnet completely, and walked back out into the firelight. "How do you like your bacon?" she asked. Jeremiah didn't look up from the fire, but the corner of his mouth twitched beneath his beard. "Crisp. And don't burn the biscuits." Weeks bled into months. The mountain winter was a harsh mistress, burying the cabin in drifts of snow that reached the roofline. Clementine, or Clem, as Jeremiah had started calling her, fell into a rhythm. The fear didn't vanish overnight. For the first 2 weeks, she slept with a paring knife under her pillow. Every time Jeremiah raised his voice, which was rare, or moved too quickly, she flinched. But Jeremiah was like the mountain itself, consistent. He woke before dawn, chopped wood, checked his trap lines, and returned at dusk. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. When he saw her struggling to haul water from the creek, he didn't do it for her. Instead, he spent an evening rigging a pulley system so she could do it herself without strain. He wasn't pampering her. He was teaching her to survive. One evening in late January, a blizzard howled outside, shaking the sturdy timbers of the cabin. The wind sounded like screaming women. Clem was mending one of Jeremiah's wool socks by the firelight. Jeremiah was sitting in his leather armchair reading. This had been the biggest shock of her new life. The beast was a scholar. The bookshelves weren't for show. They were filled with Shakespeare-heavy volumes on geology law books and engineering manuals. Clem watched him turn a page of The Count of Monte Cristo. "You can read," she said. It was a statement, but it carried the weight of a question. Jeremiah looked over the top of the book. He wore small, wire-rimmed spectacles that made him look strangely distinguished. "Is that surprising? My father said you were a savage. Said you were raised by wolves." "Wolves have better manners than your father," Jeremiah muttered. He closed the book. "Can you read?" "A little," Clem admitted. "My mother taught me before the fire. But the words get jumbled sometimes." Jeremiah stood up and walked to the shelf. He pulled down a thin volume. Aesop's Fables. He handed it to her. "Read the first page." Clem took the book. Her hands shook slightly. She stumbled through the first sentence, mispronouncing tortoise. "Stop," Jeremiah said. He pulled his chair closer, the wood scraping against the floorboards. "It's tortoise. Look at the vowels." For the next 2 hours, the storm outside was forgotten. Jeremiah was a strict teacher, impatient with laziness, but infinitely patient with genuine struggle. He corrected her pronunciation, explained the meanings of words, and treated her mind with a respect no one had ever shown her face. "Why?" Clem asked after they finished a chapter. "Why do you care if I can read? Because ignorance is a chain," Jeremiah said, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "And I don't keep slaves." He stood up to pour coffee. "Besides, there's things in this cabin. Papers that need reading. If something happens to me, you need to know what you're looking at." "What kind of papers?" Jeremiah hesitated. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The cozy domesticity evaporated, replaced by a cold tension. "The kind that get men killed," he said, darkly. He walked to a loose floorboard near the hearth and pried it open with his boot heel. He pulled out a metal lockbox. He set it on the table. "Clem, what do you know about the Great Fire of '68? The one that burned the courthouse in Purgatory Creek?" "I was a child," she said, touching her scar subconsciously. "That was the same year I got burned. It wasn't an accident," Jeremiah said. His voice was low, dangerous. "The courthouse didn't just catch fire. It was torched to burn land deeds, specifically the deeds to the entire northern ridge, the land where the new silver vein was just found." Clem's heart hammered. "Who torched it?" Jeremiah looked at her, his blue eyes hard as ice. "Buford Taggart, and the man who helped him. The man who carried the kerosene was Otis O'Hara." Clem gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "My father, no. He's a drunk, but he's not." "He wasn't a drunk then," Jeremiah corrected. "He was a desperate man. Taggart promised him a cut. But Taggart never pays his debts. Instead, he made sure there was an accident at your house a week later to keep Otis scared, to keep him silent." The realization hit Clem like a physical blow. The fire, the lantern. It wasn't her clumsiness. It wasn't an accident. "He burned me," she whispered, tears welling up. "To scare my father. He burned you to own your father," Jeremiah said, "and he succeeded, until I bought the debt." He tapped the metal box. "I was the surveyor back then, Clem, before I came up here. I have the original copies of the surveys. I know who really owns that land. It's not Taggart. Who owns it?" Jeremiah looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and intensity. "Your mother did, and now you do." The revelation that she owned the very land Taggart was stripping bare changed something fundamental in Clementine. The fear that had defined her existence since the fire began to calcify into a cold, hard resolve. She wasn't just a scarred girl hiding in a mountain man's cabin anymore. She was an heiress to a fortune, and more importantly, she was the daughter of a woman who had been wronged. February broke with a false spring. The snow melted into slush during the day and froze into treacherous sheets of ice at night. With the change in weather came a change in the dynamic between Jeremiah and Clementine. Jeremiah no longer treated her like a guest or a refugee. He treated her like a soldier. "Hold it higher," Jeremiah commanded. They were standing in a clearing 100 yards from the cabin. He had set up empty whiskey bottles on a fallen log. Clementine's arms ached. The Winchester 1873 was heavy, the walnut stock digging into her shoulder. "It's too heavy." She gritted out her left eye, squinting against the glare of the snow. "Taggart's men won't care if it's heavy," Jeremiah said, his voice flat. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "They won't care that you're tired. They won't care that you're a woman. If you can't pull that trigger, you're just a victim waiting to happen. Are you a victim, Clem?" "No," she snapped. She adjusted her stance, widening her feet as he had taught her. "Then breathe. Squeeze. Don't pull." She inhaled the cold air filling her lungs. She focused on the center bottle. She thought of Taggart's sneering face. She thought of her father trembling and selling her for a poker chip. She squeezed. Crack! The rifle kicked against her shoulder, a dull bruise already forming there. The bottle in the center exploded in a shower of amber glass. "Good," Jeremiah said. It was the most praise she'd gotten all week. Again. As the weeks passed, Clementine learned to strip and clean the rifle blindfolded. She learned to identify the tracks of a mountain lion versus a wolf. She learned that the mountain wasn't just a landscape. It was a living thing that could kill you or save you depending on how much respect you showed it. But amidst the training, the silence between them began to fill with something else. One evening, Jeremiah returned from the trap line with a deep gash on his forearm, a slip of a skinning knife. He sat by the fire, struggling to wrap a bandage around it, one-handed. "Let me," Clementine said, taking the linen strip from his hand. He hesitated, then surrendered his arm. He had rolled up his sleeve, revealing a forearm that was thick with muscle and mapped with old scars. Bullet holes, knife slashes, bite marks. As she cleaned the wound with whiskey, he didn't flinch. She worked with gentle precision, her fingers brushing against his rough skin. The firelight danced in the room, casting long, intimate shadows. "You have scars, too," she whispered, tying off the bandage. "Detailed maps of bad decisions." Jeremiah grunted. He looked down at her. She was kneeling by his chair, her face turned up toward him. The firelight softened the jagged edges of her own scars, making the red tissue look like burnished copper. For the first time, Clementine didn't look away. She saw the way his eyes tracked her features, not with pity, but with a hunger he was trying desperately to suppress. "Why do you stay up here, Jeremiah?" she asked softly. "You have gold. You have a mind that could run a university. Why live like a ghost?" Jeremiah looked into the flames. "Because down there, down in the towns, men wear masks. They smile while they rob you. They shake your hand while they plan your murder. Up here the wind is honest. The cold is honest. If the mountain wants to kill you, it doesn't lie about it." He looked back at her, his gaze dropping to her lips. "I was tired of the lies, Clem. Until you came up here, I didn't think I'd ever see anything true again." The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with an electric tension. Jeremiah reached out his hand, hovering near her face. This time she leaned into it. His thumb brushed the unscarred skin of her cheek, his touch calloused but impossibly tender. "You're beautiful," he said, the words rough like they were being dragged out of him. "You know that the fire didn't take it. It just framed it." Clementine's heart hammered against her ribs. She closed her eyes, leaning her forehead against his knee. It was a moment of absolute peace, a fragile blossom in the middle of a frozen wasteland. But peace in Purgatory Creek was always temporary. 3 days later, the dog started barking. Jeremiah had a wolf-dog hybrid named Buster that usually slept under the porch, but now Buster was standing on the ridge, hackles raised, issuing a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the crisp morning air. Jeremiah was out the door in a second rifle in hand. Clementine grabbed hers and followed her heart in her throat. "Get back inside," Jeremiah hissed. "No," she said, chambering around. "I'm not a victim, remember." Jeremiah didn't argue. He pointed to the tree line. A single rider was emerging from the pines. He was waving a white handkerchief tied to a stick. Jeremiah watched him through the scope. "It's McGraw, one of the sheriff's deputies, but he's a decent man, mostly." The rider approached slowly, keeping his hands visible. He stopped 20 yards out. "Jeremiah," McGraw shouted, his breath puffing in the cold. "I ain't here for a fight. Then state your business and turn around," Jeremiah called back, not lowering the rifle. "I got a message from Taggart. I don't read mail from snakes." "He knows Jeremiah," McGraw yelled, his voice cracking with fear. "Otis. They found Otis in the creek 3 days ago, dead. But before he died, Taggart worked him over. Otis told him about the box, about the surveys." Clementine felt the blood drain from her face. Her father was dead. The last link to her past severed. "Taggart is coming," McGraw continued. "He's hired the Pinkertons. He's got a posse of 20 men, Jeremiah. Hard men. They're coming for the girl, and they're coming for the papers. He says if you hand her over, he'll let you live." Jeremiah racked the slide of his Winchester. The sound was loud in the silence. "You go back and tell Taggart something for me." Jeremiah roared, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Tell him the girl is mine. Tell him the land is hers. And tell him if he steps 1 foot past the timberline, I will bury him so deep the devil won't be able to find him." McGraw nodded nervously. "I'll tell him. But Jeremiah, 20 men. You can't fight an army." "Watch me," Jeremiah said. McGraw turned his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the trees. Jeremiah turned to Clementine. She expected to see fear in his eyes. Instead, she saw a terrifying calm. The calm of a predator who has finally found a worthy hunt. "Pack the essentials, Gunfire," he said. "Ammo, dried meat, the medical kit, and the lockbox." "Are we leaving?" Clementine asked. "No," Jeremiah said, looking at the cabin that he had built with his own hands. "This is our high ground. We don't run. We dig in." They spent the next 48 hours turning the cabin into a fortress. Jeremiah boarded up the windows, leaving only narrow firing slits. He created kill zones in the clearing, clearing away brush and marking ranges on the trees with white chalk. He placed buckets of water in every corner in case of fire. He checked and rechecked their ammunition. They had 400 rounds. It sounded like a lot. It wasn't. The attack didn't come at high noon. It came, as Jeremiah predicted, in the witching hour, that darkest part of the night, just before dawn. Clementine was keeping watch at the east window. She was exhausted, her eyes burning, but the fear kept her awake. The moon was obscured by heavy clouds. The world was a canvas of black and grey. Then a shadow moved. "Jeremiah," she whispered. He was beside her in an instant, moving silently in his stocking feet. He peered through the slit. "I see them," he murmured. 3 by the stable. 2 coming up the creek bed. They're trying to flank us. Do I shoot? Wait, Jeremiah said. Wait until they commit. Wait until there's no going back. The shadows crept closer. Clementine could see the glint of metal in the starlight. They were creeping low, confident in the darkness. Suddenly a torch flared to life near the stable. One of the men was preparing to throw it onto the thatched roof of the lean-to. "Now!" Jeremiah yelled. He kicked open a shutter and fired. The boom of the Winchester was deafening in the enclosed space. The man with the torch dropped instantly the firebrand, falling harmlessly into the snow. "Down!" Jeremiah shoved Clementine to the floor as the cabin erupted in splintering wood. Bullets hammered the logs, punching through the chinking, shattering the clay pots on the shelves. The noise was apocalyptic. Clementine crawled to her firing slit, her heart thudding so hard it hurt. She saw a muzzle flash in the trees. She aimed, remembered to breathe, and fired. She didn't know if she hit him, but the firing from that spot stopped. "Keep them pinned!" Jeremiah shouted, moving to the back window. He was firing with a rhythm, bang, rack, every shot calculated. For an hour it was chaos. The smell of gunpowder filled the cabin, acrid and choking. Clementine's shoulder was numb from the recoil. She was operating on pure adrenaline, a machine of survival. She wasn't Clementine, the scarred girl, anymore. She was a defender of her home. "They're falling back," she yelled, seeing the shadows retreat into the tree line. "Regrouping," Jeremiah corrected, reloading his tube magazine. "They're testing our defenses. The next wave will be harder." He was right. 10 minutes later, a heavy thud shook the front door. Then another. "Battering ram!" Jeremiah roared. "They're at the door!" He fired through the heavy oak door, hoping to hit the men on the other side. A scream suggested he succeeded, but the thudding continued. Crack! The heavy timber of the door frame began to give. "Clem the trapdoor," Jeremiah ordered. In the center of the cabin, under the bear rug, was a root cellar. But Jeremiah had dug a tunnel from it, leading out to the stable. "I'm not leaving you," she screamed over the noise of the gunfire. "You're not leaving." "We're flanking them." Jeremiah grabbed 2 sticks of dynamite from his supply shelf, mining charges he'd saved. He lit the fuses from the hearth fire. "Count to 5, then open the door," he yelled. "Are you crazy? Trust me." Clementine stood by the door, her hand on the heavy iron bolt. The battering ram slammed against it again. The wood splintered. 1, 2, 3. Jeremiah held the hissing dynamite. 4, 5, open it. Clementine threw the bolt and dove to the side. The door flew open. 3 men tumbled in, led by a brute with a sledgehammer. Jeremiah tossed the bundle of dynamite right at their feet and tackled Clementine, covering her body with his own, behind the overturned heavy oak table. Boom! The explosion blew out the front wall of the cabin. The concussion wave felt like a punch to the gut. Dust, smoke, and debris filled the air. Clementine's ears rang with a high-pitched whine. Jeremiah pulled her up. He was bleeding from a cut on his forehead, blood masking one eye. "Move to the stable. Now." They scrambled through the smoke. The front of the cabin was a ruin. The men who had broken in were gone, buried under logs or blown back into the snow. But the rest of the posse was still out there, and now the cabin was compromised. They sprinted into the freezing night air, dashing for the stable where the horses were panicked but alive. "There, by the barn," a voice shouted. A bullet caught Jeremiah in the thigh. He grunted, stumbling hard. He went down in the snow. "Jeremiah!" Clementine screamed. She grabbed him by his vest, trying to haul him up. He was dead weight, his massive frame too much for her. "Leave me," he gasped, clutching his leg. Dark blood was steaming in the snow. "Take the horse. Go to Denver. You have the papers." "No." Clementine dropped to her knees, leveling her rifle over his prone body. "I don't care about the papers. I care about you." 3 men were running toward them across the clearing, sensing the kill. Clementine didn't hesitate. She didn't tremble. She fired. 1 man went down. She racked the lever. She fired again. The 2nd man spun around, clutching his shoulder. The 3rd man, a tall figure in a long duster, stopped, raising a pistol. It was Taggart. He aimed at Clementine. Click. Clementine's rifle was empty. Taggart smiled, his teeth yellow in the moonlight. "End of the road, Scarface." He cocked the hammer. Suddenly, a shadow detached itself from the roof of the stable. It wasn't a man. It was Jeremiah's wolf dog, Buster. The beast launched itself through the air, silent and deadly, slamming into Taggart's chest. Taggart's gun went off the bullet, going wild into the sky. He screamed as the dog tore at his arm. "Now," Jeremiah groaned. "Help me up." With a strength born of desperation, Clementine hauled Jeremiah to his feet. They stumbled into the stable. Jeremiah collapsed against a bale of hay. "The mule," he wheezed. "Pack the mule. We can't ride. We have to climb." "Climb where?" Clementine cried frantically, tying a tourniquet around his leg with a strip of her petticoat. "The Devil's Staircase," Jeremiah said, pointing toward the sheer cliffs that loomed behind the cabin. "It's a goat trail. They can't follow us on horses. It leads to the old mining caves." "Jeremiah, you can barely walk." "Then you'll have to carry me," he said, gripping her hand. His blue eyes were dimming with pain, but the fire in them was still there. "We go up, Clem. We go up or we die." Outside, Taggart had thrown off the dog and was shouting orders. "Burn it. Burn the stable. Flush them out like rats." Clementine looked at the man she loved, the man who had seen her face and called it beautiful. She looked at the flames beginning to lick at the stable walls. She grabbed his arm and hoisted it over her shoulder. "Let's go," she said. They slipped out the back of the stable, just as the roof caught fire, disappearing into the dark, rocky labyrinth of the mountain, leaving their home burning behind them as a beacon of their defiance. The hunt was over. The war for survival had just begun. The Devil's Staircase was not a trail. It was a suggestion of a path etched into the granite face of the mountain by ancient geological violence. It was a ribbon of ice and scree, barely 2 feet wide in places, with a sheer drop of 1,000 feet on one side and a vertical wall of stone on the other. The wind up here was a physical assault. It screamed through the crags, carrying ice crystals that stung like buckshot. Clementine led the way, the mule's reins wrapped tightly around her wrist. The animal, sensing the danger, was skittish, its hooves clattering nervously on the frozen stone. Behind the mule, Jeremiah limped, his face a mask of grey ash. The tourniquet on his leg had slowed the bleeding, but the red stain on his trousers was spreading, freezing into a dark, stiff crust. "Keep moving," Jeremiah rasped. Every step was a battle against gravity and agony. "I am," Clementine shouted over the wind. She didn't look down. Looking down was death. They had been climbing for 3 hours. The sun was rising now, a cold, indifferent disk that offered light but no warmth. Below them, the valley was a sea of clouds. Above them, the entrance to the old mining caves waited like a dark, toothless mouth. Suddenly a ping echoed off the rock wall next to Clementine's head, followed a second later by the crack of a rifle. Stone chips sprayed her cheek. She gasped, pressing herself flat against the cliff face. "They're below us," Jeremiah hissed. He dragged himself behind a jagged outcropping. Clementine peered over the edge. Far below on the switchbacks they had traversed an hour ago, tiny figures were moving. Taggart and his men. They were moving faster than the fugitives, unencumbered by a wounded man. "They're gaining," Clementine said, her voice trembling. "Range is 400 yards, Jeremiah muttered. He tried to lift his rifle, but his hands were shaking uncontrollably from blood loss and hypothermia. He cursed, a low, guttural sound of frustration. "I can't hold it steady." "Give it to me," Clementine said. "Clem at this angle, the windage. Give it to me." She took the heavy Winchester. She didn't have Jeremiah's years of experience, but she had his lessons. Breathe, squeeze, don't pull. She rested the barrel on a rock. She found the lead rider in the sights, a man in a grey coat. She aimed high, compensating for the drop, and left compensating for the howling wind. She fired. The bullet struck the rock face 3 feet in front of the rider. The horse reared, terrified by the spark and the sound. The rider fought for control, but the path was too narrow. With a silent, terrifying grace, the horse's hind legs slipped. Man and beast tumbled backward, disappearing into the white void of the drop. Clementine squeezed her eyes shut, nausea rolling in her stomach. She had just killed a man, or at least sent him to his death. "Good shot," Jeremiah said softly. There was no judgment in his voice, only the grim practicality of war. "They'll slow down now. They have to be careful." "We need to get to the caves," Clementine said, handing the rifle back. "Can you make it?" Jeremiah looked at the steep incline ahead. He looked at his ruined leg. Then he looked at her. "Clem," he said, his voice serious. "Leave me here. Give me the rifle and the ammo. I can hold them off at the choke point. You take the papers. You can make it to the pass and down the other side to Silverton." Clementine stared at him. The wind whipped her hair around her scarred face. For the first time, she didn't try to hide it. She looked fierce, elemental, like a spirit of the mountain. "You bought me for $600, Jeremiah Holt," she said fiercely. "You haven't got your money's worth yet. I'm not leaving you to die in the snow." She grabbed his arm, pulling him up. "Now move." They struggled upward. The air grew thinner. Clementine's lungs burned. Jeremiah was leaning on her more and more heavily, his consciousness flickering in and out. Finally they reached the plateau. The entrance to the mine was there, framed by rotting timbers, a relic of a failed venture from 20 years ago. They stumbled inside. The air was stale, smelling of wet earth and ancient dust, but it was out of the wind. Clementine guided Jeremiah to a dry spot against the wall. He slid down, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Jeremiah," she slapped his cheek, "stay with me." "Cold," he whispered. "So cold." She knew what she had to do. They couldn't build a fire. The smoke would give away their position instantly. She needed to share body heat. She unpacked the blankets from the mule. She stripped off Jeremiah's heavy wet coat and his boots. She took off her own outer layers. She wrapped them both in the furs and lay down beside him, pressing her body against his. "It's okay," she whispered, stroking his matted hair. "I've got you." In the darkness of the mine, holding the man who had saved her from a living hell. Clementine. O'Hara finally understood the nature of her scar. It wasn't a mark of shame. It was armor. It had kept the weak men away. It had saved her for this man, this bear of a man, who saw the fire inside her and didn't run. "You're warm," Jeremiah mumbled, burying his face in her neck. "I'm here," she said. They lay there for an hour, listening to the wind howl outside, waiting for the footsteps of the men who wanted to kill them. And then they heard it, the crunch of boots on gravel at the cave mouth. "I know you're in there, Holt," Buford Taggart's voice echoed down the tunnel, distorted and ghostly. "There's nowhere left to run. The pass is blocked with snow. You're trapped in a hole in the ground, just like a rat." Clementine sat up slowly. Jeremiah was awake, his eyes feverishly bright, but he was too weak to stand. He reached for his pistol, checking the cylinder. "2 rounds," he whispered. Clementine checked the rifle. 3. 5 bullets, and Taggart likely had at least 4 men left. "He wants the papers," Clementine whispered. "He won't risk shooting if he thinks he might destroy the deeds." "He's a gambler," Jeremiah said. "He'll take the risk." Clementine looked around the cave. It wasn't just a hole. It was a vertical shaft mine. In the center of the cavern, a black abyss dropped down hundreds of feet into the bowels of the mountain, spanned by a narrow, rotting wooden bridge. "The bridge," Clementine said. "We hold the bridge." She helped Jeremiah drag himself behind a mine cart near the far side of the chasm. She took up a position behind a pile of fallen rocks. "Come out, girl," Taggart shouted, his voice getting closer. "Otis tells me you're quite the cook. Maybe I'll keep you around after all. A face like that, well, I suppose I could put a bag over it." Laughter echoed from his men. Clementine felt a cold rage settle in her chest. It was sharp and clear like a blade of ice. "Come and get me, Taggart!" she screamed. Her voice was strong, echoing off the damp walls. Shadows stretched across the floor. Taggart stepped into the cavern, flanked by 3 men. They held repeaters ready. Taggart saw them across the bridge. He smiled. "Well, isn't this touching?" Taggart sneered. "The beauty and the beast, although I'm not sure which is which." He took a step onto the bridge. The wood creaked ominously. "Stop right there!" Clementine yelled, leveling the Winchester. "You won't shoot," Taggart said, confident in his arrogance. "You're a girl. You're trembling." He was right. She was trembling, but not from fear. "Drop the gun, Clementine," Taggart commanded. "Hand over the lockbox, and I'll make it quick for your boyfriend. Refuse, and I'll start by shooting off his kneecaps." Jeremiah tried to lift his pistol, but his hand wavered. He was fading fast. "Clem, don't." Clementine looked at Taggart. She looked at the rotting timbers of the bridge. And then she looked at the lantern hanging from a rusted hook on a support beam directly above the bridge, an old oil lantern left by miners decades ago. It was likely dry useless, but next to it, strapped to the beam, was a bundle. Jeremiah's insurance. Jeremiah had told her about the mines. He told her they were unstable. He told her he had rigged supports with blasting caps years ago to collapse them if claim jumpers ever tried to take over. She looked at Jeremiah. He followed her gaze to the beam. He understood. He nodded a microscopic movement. "I said drop it!" Taggart roared, taking another step. His men followed, crowding onto the bridge. "I own this land," Clementine said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "And I'm evicting you." She didn't aim at Taggart. She aimed at the support beam above their heads, specifically at the small, rusted blasting cap wedged into the dynamite bundle Jeremiah had left there 5 years ago. It was a 1 in a million shot. The dynamite might be wet. The cap might be a dud. She didn't care. She squeezed. Crack! For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Taggart laughed. "You missed by a mile, you stupid by..." Boom! The explosion was deafening in the confined space. It didn't bring down the whole ceiling, but it shattered the main support beam holding the bridge. The structure groaned, a sound like a dying leviathan. Taggart's eyes went wide. He looked up just as the beam sheared. The bridge didn't just break. It disintegrated. The floor dropped out from under them. Taggart screamed a high, thin sound that was cut short as he and his 3 men plummeted into the black abyss of the shaft. Clementine watched them fall. There was no sound of them hitting the bottom. The hole was too deep. Silence rushed back into the cave, broken only by the settling of dust and the ringing in her ears. She dropped the rifle and scrambled over to Jeremiah.
"We did it!"
she sobbed, grabbing his face.
"Jeremiah, we did it!"
He smiled, weak but genuine. "You did it, Clem. You—" His eyes closed. His head lolled to the side. Jeremiah. Jeremiah. 6 months later. The summer had come to the high country, transforming the white wasteland into a riot of wildflowers. Columbines and Indian paintbrush painted the slopes in blue and red. The cabin had been rebuilt. It was larger now, with a proper porch and glass windows that looked out over the valley. Clementine stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. The scar on her face was still there, visible in the bright sunlight. But she wore no veil. She hadn't worn one since that night in the mine. She watched a figure riding up the trail. Jeremiah sat tall in the saddle. He walked with a cane. Now the leg would never be fully right, and he couldn't climb the crags like a mountain goat anymore, but he was alive. He was strong. He pulled the horse up to the porch and dismounted stiffly. He carried a leather satchel. "What did the lawyer say?" Clementine asked, pouring him a cup of lemonade. Jeremiah took the cup, drinking it in one long gulp. He smiled, the crinkles around his blue eyes deepening. He said the O'Hara claim is ironclad. The survey papers held up in court. Taggart's estate has been liquidated to pay for the damages to your property. "Our property," Clementine corrected him. "Our property." Jeremiah agreed. He stepped up onto the porch and pulled her into his arms. He smelled of pine horse and sunshine. "They're calling you the Silver Queen down in town," Jeremiah teased, tracing the line of her jaw. "Richest woman in the territory. You could move to San Francisco, buy a mansion, get the best doctors to fix things." Clementine leaned into his hand. "I'm already home, Jeremiah, and nothing needs fixing." He kissed her, then a deep, lingering kiss that tasted of sweet lemons and a future that belonged only to them. Down in Purgatory Creek, the gamblers still told the story. They talked about the girl who was sold for a debt and the mountain man who bought a war. They said if you listened closely, when the wind blew through the Devil's Staircase, you could still hear Taggart screaming. But up here above the timberline, there were no ghosts. There was only the wind, the sun, and the quiet, enduring love of 2 people who had found salvation in each other's scars. The end. And that, friends, is the legend of Clementine and Jeremiah. From a dusty saloon floor to the highest peaks of the Rockies, they proved that worth isn't written on your face but in your fire. Taggart thought he could buy a life and steal a fortune, but he learned the hard way that you never corner a mountain man, and you never underestimate a woman who has already walked through fire. What do you think? Would you have taken the shot at the bridge, risking it all? Or would you have handed over the gold? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It helps get these stories to more people. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a tale from the Wild West. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon. Thanks for watching.